The take on 30 May 2025, the UAE crossed a threshold the region had been watching for years. Federal Decree Law Number 11 of 2024 on the reduction of climate change effects entered into force, making the UAE the first country in MENA to impose legally binding greenhouse gas reporting obligations on every entity operating within its borders. Public and private, onshore and free zone, multinationals and SMEs, no exceptions, 1 year to comply. That deadline, 30th of May 2026, has now been delayed. No replacement date has been announced. No reason has been given. Just sit with that for a moment. The UAE's flagship climate accountability mechanism has been quietly shelved, and nobody has explained why. I want to be transparent about my own position here. The most plausible explanation, in my view, is the broader geopolitical instability playing out across the Middle East. The conflict has consumed political bandwidth, strained government priorities, and made enforcement of a complex new reporting framework feel, I imagine, like a problem to park. That is my inference. It has not been confirmed. No official explanation has been offered, and that silence is, in its own way, telling. When a government delays its flagship climate commitment without explanation, the message reaching markets, investors, and the businesses trying to plan around it is not neutral. Unexplained uncertainty is its own kind of signal. Here is what was on the table before the delay. The law required every entity in the UAE to measure and report Scope 1, 2, and where applicable Scope 3 emissions using government-approved methodologies and the National Measurement, Reporting and Verification Platform that had only recently launched. Non-compliance carried fines from AED 5,000 to AED 2 million, doubled to AED 4 million for repeat breaches within 2 years, with license suspension and regulatory blacklisting also available. These were not symbolic gestures. They were the enforcement substance behind years of sustainability ambition, and they are now in abeyance, with no timeline for return. The implications for UAE sustainability leadership deserve honest examination. The UAE hosted COP28. It positioned itself as the region's bridge between development imperatives and climate accountability. Federal Decree Law Number 11 was the moment that positioning became something more than rhetoric. It moved the UAE from aspirational targets to enforceable, legally binding obligations. That was genuinely significant. But a deadline without a successor date sends a very different message, that climate compliance is conditional, that it holds until it becomes inconvenient, and that the commitment flexes under pressure. International investors, ESG-linked supply chains, and the institutional capital looking for jurisdictions with credible governance are watching. They are not unsympathetic to the pressures the region is under, but they are doing the maths. The governance question gets sharper when you look at what boards will actually do in the coming weeks. This delay will function as a sorting mechanism. Companies that were treating the May 2026 deadline as a compliance obligation will breathe out. Budgets get reallocated, the sustainability hire gets deprioritized, the board agenda item slides. Companies that were treating the work as a genuine organizational transformation will barely notice, because the work was never really about the fine. It was about building the emissions visibility and governance infrastructure that protects the business in a world where this scrutiny only intensifies, regardless of what any specific government deadline says. Which camp your organization falls into will say a great deal about the maturity of how sustainability sits in your decision making, not in the strategy document, in the room where decisions are actually made. Now, the marketing dimension, and I say this as someone who works at the intersection of communications and law. Over the past decade, UAE brands across real estate, hospitality, finance, retail, and industrials have invested heavily in sustainability narratives, net zero commitments, SDG alignment, green credentials, eco-certifications. These were strategic communications decisions, and in many cases they were made well ahead of the operational reality they implied. There is nothing dishonest about aspiration, but what the climate change law had done for 1 year before this delay was convert the gap between the marketing claim and the operational truth into a legal liability. It placed a legal obligation behind the brand story. That obligation has now been lifted. Boards who were uncomfortable with the gap between what they said publicly and what their emissions data actually showed now have room to breathe. The question is what they do with it. Close the gap or just delay the reckoning. Whatever the cause of this delay, the conflict across the region is worth addressing directly. because it does not exist separately from the climate story. The instability has done real environmental damage. Attacks on oil infrastructure, shipping reroutes that have pushed maritime emissions sharply upward, disruption to renewable energy pipelines, and ecological contamination across affected zones. The conflict has not paused the climate problem. In several measurable respects, it has made it worse. There is a genuinely uncomfortable irony in suspending mandatory emissions reporting at precisely the moment the region's environmental footprint has been most disrupted. The climate does not observe a ceasefire. That said, I want to offer the more constructive reading because it is credible. There is a version of this delay that makes sense. If the additional time is used to strengthen the MRV platform, issue clearer guidance for smaller businesses, finalize implementing regulations that arrived late the first time, and come back with a new deadline that is harder to miss because the supporting infrastructure is finally in place, then the pause has genuine purpose. The UAE's legislative head start gives it a real structural advantage over regional peers that have yet to legislate at all. But that advantage only holds if this delay is purposeful and comes with a timeline. If it just drifts, the advantage erodes. What this moment actually calls for is straightforward, a clear statement from government, not just a delay, a stated intention, a revised date, a credible account of how the additional time will be used to strengthen rather than quietly soften the framework. Without that, what we have is not responsible crisis management. It is the kind of regulatory blink that makes serious climate governance look negotiable. The UAE cannot sustain its claim to regional sustainability leadership while treating its own flagship climate law as something that holds only when conditions are favorable. For businesses, the delay changes the timetable. It does not change the direction of travel. How you respond in the next few months will matter more than any compliance deadline ever could. The signal, a delay without a replacement date, is not a postponement. It is a suspension, and when the first mandatory GHG reporting framework in MENA goes into suspension with no new deadline and no explanation, the question stops being about compliance. It becomes about whether the commitment was ever unconditional to begin with. Sources: Federal Decree Law Number 11 of 2024, PwC Middle East Legal Analysis, 2025, OMFIF. The Gulf's resilience faces a new geopolitical test, March 2026. Note: no official reason for the deadline delay has been stated by the UAE government at time of publication. The connection to regional instability is the author's own inference. The question: the deadline has been lifted, no replacement has been set. So what does your organization do now? Do you keep going because the direction of travel has not changed and doing this properly was always the point? Or does the agenda item quietly disappear from the board pack until a regulator forces it back? Your answer to that question will tell you, and everyone watching, exactly what your sustainability commitment was actually built on. Sources and further reading: PwC Middle East, UAE Climate Change Law, Mandatory Emissions Reporting Obligations, https www.pwc.com m1.en. Services: Legal News Alerts, 2025 UAE Climate Change Law, Mandatory Emissions Reporting Obligations, HTML BSA Law, UAE Climate Law, what every business needs to know before May 2026, https bisalor.com. Insight: UAE Climate Law, what every business needs to know before May 2026, BDO Al Amri, UAE Climate Change Law Compliance, Practical Requirements for Businesses, 2025 to 2026, https www.bdoalamri.com, ENGB. Insights: UAE Climate Change Law, Compliance Practical Requirements for Businesses, 2025 to 2026, ASC Global, UAE ESG Risk Revolution, Mandatory Climate Reporting, 2026, https ascglobal.ae. Insight: Details: UAE ESG Risk Revolution, Mandatory Climate Reporting Framework for 2026 and beyond. British Chamber of Commerce Dubai, how the UAE's new climate law is making ESG a strategic imperative, https britishchamberdubai.com. News details: 4827 OMFIF. The Gulf's resilience faces a new geopolitical test, https www.omfif.org. 2026 There are three. The Gulf's resilience faces a new geopolitical test, Middle East Council on Global Affairs, Bridging the Gulf, Energy Policy and Climate Governance in the GCHTPS, council.org publication, Bridging the Gulf Energy Policy and Climate Governance in the GCC, IFRS Lab UAE, Greenwashing Under Scrutiny, Why 2025 Marks a New Era of ESG Regulation, HTTPS, IFRS Lab AE blog, Greenwashing Under Scrutiny, Why 2025 Marks a New Era of ESG Regulation. The views expressed in this newsletter are Jonathan Ashton's own personal perspectives and do not represent the views of his employer or any affiliated organization. Common Ground is published weekly. If this was shared with you, subscribe on LinkedIn to receive it directly.